2 hours after the Kennedy assassination, Lyndon Johnson took the presidential oath of office aboard a plane at the Dallas airport. On the one hand, as a native of rural West Texas and a graduate of a little-known teachers college, he seemed unsophisticated compared to the wealthy, Harvard-educated Kennedy. On the other hand, Johnson was a skilled politician who had started his career as a devoted Roosevelt Democrat during the Great Depression. As the new president, Johnson was determined to expand the social reforms of the New Deal. During his almost 30 years in Congress, he had learned how to get things done. Shortly after taking office, Johnson persuaded Congress to pass one, an expanded version of Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill, and two, Kennedy's proposal for an income tax cut. The latter measure sparked an increase in jobs, consumer spending, and a long period of economic expansion in the 60s. When Johnson decided not to run in the 1968 election, Richard Nixon took advantage of the opportunity and won. Throughout the 1970s, the Democrats continued to hold majorities in both houses of Congress. The Republican president had to live with this reality and obtain some concessions from Congress through moderation and compromise. At the same time, Nixon laid the foundation for a shift in public opinion toward conservatism and for Republican gains that would challenge and overthrow Democratic control of Congress in the 1980s and 1990s. Now let's look at the domestic policies and issues practiced and faced by Presidents Johnson and Nixon. Michael Harrington's best-selling book on poverty, The Other America, helped to focus national attention on the 40 million Americans still living in poverty. Johnson responded by declaring in 1964 an unconditional war on poverty. The Democratic Congress gave the president almost everything he had asked for by creating the Office of Economic Opportunity, the OEO, and providing this anti-poverty agency with a billion-dollar budget. The OEO sponsored a wide variety of self-help programs for the poor, such as Head Start for preschoolers, the Job Corps for vocational education, literacy programs, and legal services. The controversial Community Action Program allowed the poor to run anti-poverty programs in their own neighborhoods. Like the New Deal, some of Johnson's programs produced results while others did not. Nevertheless, before being cut back to pay for the far more costly Vietnam War, the war on poverty did significantly reduce the number of American families living in poverty. Johnson's list of legislative achievements from 1963 to 1966 is long and includes new programs that would have lasting effects on U.S. society. A few examples would be the Food Stamp Act, Medicare, and Medicaid. In addition to the programs I listed, Congress increased funding for mass transit, public housing, rent subsidies for low-income people, and crime prevention. Johnson also established two new cabinet departments, the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Congress, in response to Ralph Nader's book Unsafe at Any Speed, also passed regulations of the automobile industry that would have hundreds of thousands of lives in the following years. Clean air and water laws were enacted in part as a response to Rachel Carson's expose of pesticides, Silent Spring. Federal parks and wilderness areas were expanded. LBJ's wife, Lady Bird Johnson, contributed to improving the environment with her Beautify America campaign, which resulted in the Highway Beautification Act that removed billboards from federal roads. Critics have attacked Johnson's Great Society for making unrealistic promises to eliminate poverty, for creating a centralized welfare state, and for being inefficient and very costly. On the other hand, defenders point out that these programs gave vitally needed assistance to millions of Americans who had previously been forgotten or ignored: the poor, the disabled, and the elderly. Johnson himself would jeopardize the Democrats' vast domestic achievements by escalating the war in Vietnam, a war that resulted in higher taxes and inflation. Ironically, a Southern president succeeded in persuading Congress to enact the most popular civil rights laws since Reconstruction. Even before the 1964 election, Johnson managed to persuade both a majority of Democrats and some Republicans in Congress to pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which made segregation illegal in all public facilities, including hotels and restaurants, and gave the federal government additional power to enforce school desegregation. This act also set up the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to end discrimination in employment on the basis of race, religion, sex, or national origin. Also in 1964, the 24th Amendment was ratified. It abolished the practice of collecting a poll tax, one of the measures that for decades had discouraged poor people from voting. A voting rights march from Selma, Alabama to the capital of Montgomery was met with beatings and tear gas in what became known as Bloody Sunday. Televised pictures of the violence proved a turning point in the civil rights movement. The national outrage moved President Johnson to send federal troops to protect King and other marchers in another attempt to petition the state government. As a result, Congress passed the powerful Voting Rights Act of 1965. Nevertheless, young African Americans were losing patience with the slow progress toward equality and the continued violence against their people by white extremists. Seeking a new cultural identity based on Africa and Islam, the black Muslim leader Elijah Muhammad preached black nationalism, separatism, and self-improvement. The movement had already attracted thousands of followers by the time a young man became a convert while serving in prison. He adopted the name Malcolm X. Leaving prison in 1952, Malcolm X acquired a reputation as the movement's most controversial voice. He criticized King as an Uncle Tom or a subservient to whites and advocated self-defense, using black violence to counter white violence. He eventually left the black Muslims and moved away from defending violence, but he was assassinated by black opponents in 1965. The autobiography of Malcolm X remains an engaging testimony to one man's development from a petty criminal into a major leader. The radicalism of Malcolm X influenced the thinking of young blacks in civil rights organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. Stokely Carmichael, the chairman of SNCC, repudiated nonviolence and advocated black power, especially economic power, and racial separatism. In 1966, the Black Panthers were organized by Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and other militants as a revolutionary socialist movement advocating self-rule for American blacks. Shortly after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the arrest of a young black motorist by white police in the black neighborhood of Watts in Los Angeles sparked a 6-day riot that killed 34 people and destroyed over 700 buildings. Race riots continued to erupt each summer in the black neighborhoods of major cities through 1968, with increasing casualties and destruction of property. Rioters shouted slogans, "Burn, baby, burn," and "Get Whitey," made whites suspect that black extremists and revolutionaries were behind the violence. There was little evidence, however, the small Black Power movement was responsible for the violence. A federal investigation of the many riots, the Kerner Commission, concluded in late 1968 that racism and segregation were chiefly responsible and that the United States was becoming two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. By the mid-1960s, the issue of civil rights had spread far beyond de jure segregation practiced under the law in the South and now included the de facto segregation and discrimination caused by racist attitudes in the North and West. Martin Luther King Jr. received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, but his nonviolent approach was under increasing pressure from all sides. His effort to use peaceful marches in urban centers of the North, such as Chicago, met with little success. King also broke with President Johnson over the Vietnam War because the war was beginning to drain money from social programs. In April 1968, the nation went into shock over the news that King, while standing on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee, had been shot and killed by a white man. Massive riots erupted in 168 cities across the country, leaving at least 46 people dead. The violence did not reflect the ideals of the murdered leader, but it did reveal the anger and frustrations among African Americans in both the North and the South. The violence also fed a growing white backlash, especially among white blue-collar voters, to the civil rights movement, which was soon reflected in election results. In the early and mid-1960s, various liberal groups began to identify with Black struggles against oppressive controls and laws. The first such group to rebel against established authority were college and university students. In 1962, a newly formed radical student organization called Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, held a meeting in Port Huron, Michigan. Following the leadership of Tom Hayden, the group issued a declaration of purposes known as the Port Huron Statement. It called for university decisions to be made through participatory democracy so that students would have a voice in decisions affecting their lives. Activists and intellectuals who supported Hayden's ideas became known as the New Left. The first major student protest took place in 1964 on the Berkeley campus of the University of California. Calling their cause the free speech movement, Berkeley students demanded an end to university restrictions on student political activities. By the mid-1960s, students across the country were protesting a variety of university rules, including those against drinking and dorm visits by members of the opposite sex. They also demanded a greater voice in the government of the university. Student demonstrations grew with the escalation of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Hundreds of campuses were disrupted or closed down by anti-war protests. The most radical fringe of the SDS, known as the Weathermen, embraced violence and vandalism in their attacks on American institutions. In the eyes of most Americans, the Weathermen's extremist act and language discredited the early idealism of the New Left. The political protests of the New Left went hand in hand with the new counterculture that was expressed by young people in rebellious styles of dress, music, drug use, and for some, communal living. The apparent dress code of the hippies and flower children of the 1960s included long hair, beards, beads, and jeans. The folk music of Joan Baez and Bob Dylan gave voice to the younger generation's protests, while the rock music of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Jim Morrison, and Janis Joplin provided the beat and lyrics for the counterculture. In 1969, a gathering of thousands of young people at the Woodstock Music Festival in Upper New York State reflected the zenith of the counterculture. However, as a result of experimenting with hallucinogenic drugs, such as LSD, or becoming addicted to various other drugs, some young people destroyed their lives. The counterculture's excesses and the economic uncertainties of the time led to its demise in the 1970s. The generation of baby boomers that came of age in the 1960s believed fervently in the ideals of a democratic society. They hoped to slay the dragons of unresponsive authority, poverty, racism, and war. However, the impatience of some activists with change, the use of violence, and the spread of self-destructive behavior discredited their cause in the eyes of others, particularly older Americans. The increased education and employment of women in the 1950s and the civil rights movement all contributed to a renewal of the women's movement in the 1960s. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, written in 1963, gave the movement a new direction by encouraging middle-class women to seek fulfillment in professional careers in addition to filling the roles of wife, mother, and homemaker. In 1966, Friedan helped found the National Organization for Women, or NOW, which adopted the activist tactics of other civil rights movements to secure equal treatment of women, especially for job opportunities. By this time, Congress had already enacted two anti-discriminatory laws, the Equal Pay Act of 1963 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. These measures prohibited discrimination in employment and compensation on the basis of gender, but had been poorly enforced. Feminists achieved a major legislative victory in 1972 when Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. This proposed constitutional amendment stated, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." Although NOW and other groups campaigned hard for the ratification of the ERA, it just missed acceptance by the required 38 states. It was defeated in part because of a growing reaction against feminism by conservatives who feared the movement threatened the traditional roles of women. Even without the ERA, the women's movement accomplished fundamental changes in attitudes and hiring practices. In increasing numbers, women moved into professions previously dominated by men: business, law, medicine, and politics. Although women still experienced the glass ceiling in the corporate world, American society at the beginning of the 21st century was less and less a man's world. Nixon tried to slow down the growth of Johnson's Great Society programs by proposing the Family Assistance Plan, which would have replaced welfare by providing a guaranteed annual income for working Americans. The Democratic majority in Congress easily defeated this initiative. The Republican president did succeed, however, in shifting some of the responsibility for social programs from the federal to the state and local levels. In a program known as revenue sharing, or the New Federalism, Congress approved giving local governments $30 billion in block grants over 5 years to address local needs as they saw fit, instead of specific uses of federal money being controlled by Washington. Republicans hoped revenue sharing would check the growth of the federal government and return responsibility to the states, where it had rested before the New Deal. Nixon attempted to bypass Congress by impounding, or not sending, funds appropriated for social programs. Democrats protested that such action was an abuse of executive powers. The courts agreed with the president's critics, arguing that it was a president's duty to carry out the laws of Congress, whether or not the president agreed with them. Starting with a recession in 1970, the U.S. economy throughout the 1970s faced the unusual combination of economic slowdown and high inflation, a condition referred to as stagflation. To slow inflation, Nixon at first tried to cut federal spending. However, when this policy contributed to a recession and unemployment, he adopted Keynesian economics and deficit spending so as not to alienate middle-class and blue-collar Americans. In August 1971, he surprised the nation by imposing a 90-day wage and price freeze. Next, he took the dollar off the gold standard, which helped to devalue it relative to foreign currencies. This action, combined with a 10% surtax on all imports, improved the U.S. balance of trade with foreign competitors. By the election year of 1972, the recession was over. Also in that year, Congress approved automatic increases for Social Security benefits, based on the annual rise in the cost of living. This measure protected seniors, the poor, and the disabled from the worst effects of inflation, but also contributed to the budget problems in the future. In 1972, Congress also passed Title IX, a statute to end sex discrimination in schools that received federal funding. Though far-reaching, the law is best known for its requirement that schools provide girls with equal athletic opportunities. Many believe that these new opportunities in athletics proved to be a key step in promoting women's equality. The success of Nixon's Southern strategy became evident in the presidential election of 1972, when the Republican ticket won majorities in every Southern state. Nixon's re-election was practically assured by 1. His foreign policy successes in China and the Soviet Union, 2. The removal of George Wallace from the race by an assassin's bullet that paralyzed the Alabama populace, and 3. The nomination by the Democrats of a very liberal, anti-war, anti-establishment candidate, Senator George McGovern of South Dakota. On Election Day, Nixon overwhelmed McGovern in a landslide victory that carried every state but Massachusetts and won 61% of the popular vote. The Democrats still managed to keep control of both houses of Congress. Nevertheless, the voting patterns for Nixon indicated the start of a major political realignment of the Sun Belt and suburban voters, who were forming a new Republican majority. Nixon's electoral triumph in 1972 made the Watergate revelations and scandals of '73 all the more surprising. The tragedy of Watergate went well beyond the public humiliation of Richard Nixon and the conviction and jailing of 26 White House officials and aides. Watergate had a paralyzing effect on the political system in the mid-1970s, a critical time both at home and overseas when the country needed respected, strong, and confident leadership. Watch this video to see what happened with the Watergate scandal.
It was a political scandal that changed our country forever, beginning with the break-in at Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate office complex, and ending in the resignation of President Richard Nixon. Tonight, on the eve of the 45th anniversary of the Watergate break-in, we take an in-depth look at the events that led to his downfall.
The president is going to address the nation and presumably announce his resignation in a half an hour from now.
People will be at television sets and radios tonight to hear what the president has to say.
This is the political crime story of the century.
In just a moment now, the President of the United States will begin his speech, perhaps his last speech from the White House.
He always saw enemies. He always saw people in the shadows. And his motto, I believe, was, do unto others before they have a chance to do unto you.
That's enough.
There was an obsession with leaks. You don't blame the leaks when facts come out that are showing wrongdoing.
No, there will be no picture.
This is the funny thing. Had it not been for Watergate, I think this man could have gone down in history as one of the more significant presidents in the history of this country.
Out. You don't have to stay, do you?
We were witnessing the implosion of an American presidency.
The President has taken his place at the table in the White House where he's going to speak. Here now, the next picture will be the President of the United States.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
It was the scandal that took down a president, a plot of lies, espionage, and secret dealings that shattered how the nation viewed their presidency and the truth. It all started here, the now infamous Watergate office building, when police were called to investigate a strange break-in.
I was a sergeant assigned to the people on the street, called us the bum squad.
What I looked like in 1972 was like a junior Charles Manson.
Georgetown, Friday night going into Saturday is always crazy back then.
On June 17, 1972, there was a break-in at the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate office complex. This was the start of what would be the political crime of the century.
At the center of it all were two men, G. Gordon Liddy, an ex-FBI agent who had been hired by President Nixon's campaign to run covert operations. He recruited James McCord, the security chief of the committee to re-elect the president.
And the plan was to get negative information about the potential nominee of the Democratic Party. But how are you going to get the negative information? A lot of people would say breaking into the Democratic National Committee was way out, off the charts. Yes, but not that far off.
McCord would go into the Watergate building and put in tapes in the door.
It was taped, so it would not lock.
The hero of that night was a man named Frank Wills. Frank Wills was the security guard at the Watergate office building.
You found the door taped once, and you took the tape off. And then you found it taped a second time.
It was something that told me that you should check, not only check the door, but that you call the police.
About 1:52 in the morning, the call comes out for an alleged burglary at the Watergate Hotel. I just kind of blinked my eyes. Yeah, we'll take the call. I had on a old funky golf cap. I think I had just like a T-shirt underneath, trying to give me the image I wasn't a police officer.
If a uniformed car had answered that call, it could have been a whole different ballgame.
There's a lookout, Alfred Baldwin, who's supposed to warn the burglars if there's trouble. The police unit that responds to the call, they're not dressed like police officers. So Baldwin doesn't even notice them.
Our adrenaline is pumped. We get to this room here. I kicked the door open.
I pulled my revolver.
Baldwin was supposed to be the lookout across the street.
He was watching a show called Attack of the Puppet People. By the time Alfred Baldwin had notified them, it was too late, and they had to run and hide like rats. We're rolling down this hallway, checking the offices on both sides of the hallways, make sure that nobody's hiding from behind us. I was startled by an arm hitting next to the glass on the petition. It scared the living bejesus out of me. I screamed something to the effect, "Come out with your hands up or I'm gonna blow your head off." 10 hands went up, and they came out, and that's where the arrest occurred, right here. The 5 burglars that were arrested inside the DNC, McCord, Barker, Sturgis, Martinez, and Gonzalez. This was not your normal, typical burglary. There was bugging devices, tear gas pens, many, many rolls of film, locksmith tools, thousands of dollars in $100 bills consecutively ordered.
Who goes into the Democratic National Committee looking for money or looking for jewels? No, you go looking for political information. And who wants that? Why, your opponent, naturally.
People weren't saying, "Oh my God, this is clearly going to implicate Richard Nixon." It just seemed bizarre. It would take some enterprising young journalists to ferret out the importance of the story.
Woodward and Bernstein were assigned to this burglary just as a matter of routine.
Editors kind of said, "We got this strange burglary."
They were young reporters trying to make their way up the ladder in the Washington Post.
When you talk about the people who made a difference when it came to Watergate, you talk about Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein.
They sent me to the courthouse where the 5 burglars caught in the Democratic headquarters were being arraigned. The judge asked the leader, James McCord, "Where did you work?" And McCord went, "CIA." It was stunning.
And they discovered that McCord was a security chief for the committee to re-elect the president. Well, okay, folks, this was a political break-in.
There was a notebook belonging to one of the burglars that had the name in it, H. Hunt W. House. And of course, it turned out to be Howard Hunt, who had worked for the CIA, who had been hired at the White House really to undertake dirty tricks.
You knew that this smoke that was billowing up from the Oval Office, there had to be some fire there.
It's like the Dylan song, "It don't take a weatherman to know which way the wind blows."
Presidential Press Secretary Ron Ziegler called it a third-rate burglary attempt and said it was nothing the president would ever be concerned with.
Richard Nixon is obstructing justice from the beginning. But what would be known as the smoking gun was when he approves a plan to use the CIA to blunt an FBI investigation into the money that the burglars had. It's clear in the conversation this is being done for political purposes, basically to save the skin of the White House, and the president says he approves it.
Woodward and Bernstein had scores of sources, but there was one source that was special. A guy really high up. He was known as Deep Throat.
We would learn years later that Deep Throat was Mark Felt, number 2 at the FBI.
He was in the perfect position to understand what was coming into the investigation, as well as what he could observe maybe from above the investigation.
I want to talk about Watergate.
We're not going to talk about that subject.
All the president's men created a sense of danger. They were constantly risking things by trying to find out the truth.
You can trust me, you know that.
The other thing the movie did was create that expression, follow the money.
Just follow the money.
And put it into American culture.
Deep Throat made it clear that the money was important, that there was a trail to follow. And Carl established that a $25,000 check had actually gone into the bank account of one of the Watergate burglars.
The $25,000 check linked contributions to President Nixon's re-election campaign to the slush fund used to pay the burglars who broke into the Watergate office complex.
I said, oh my God, this now establishes an undeniable connection between the committee for Nixon's re-election and the burglars.
John Mitchell was the Attorney General. He's a Nixon loyalist.
The highest law enforcement officer in America controlled a secret fund that paid for undercover activities against Nixon's political opponents. Bradley said they're about to call the Attorney General of the United States a crook. There's never been a story like this in our history. And we took a deep breath and said, yeah.
ABC News has projected that Richard Nixon has in fact been re-elected to the presidency to a second term. So the question now, I suppose, is how big will Mr. Nixon win?
It was a giant landslide. There was virtually no reaction to the stories we did. And it was a way of saying, Watergate? Who cares?
And whatever happened to Watergate?
I don't know. Apparently nothing.
They've got a trial of the accused in that case, and that's going to be tried in due course, and I think that's probably the end of the story.
Now for the essential question. What lasting effects has the Watergate scandal had on administrations following Nixon's resignation? And use specific examples.